Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about decisions and remembering them. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, as a tech lead, how do you remember decisions made on a project, especially when your engineers asks you question over the phone and you provide answers and sometimes don't remember the context when the engineer says they did as they was instructed by you? That's an easy one. You write down in the story card what the scope change was. Done. So this is where documentation becomes an important thing. So for me, I usually try to tell people that I try to have two types of documentation. You may recall that I made a video like a little while, I don't know exactly now, but about ADRs, for example, which is this idea that you take a piece, you basically make a proposal for how a technical decision of some sort, and then you document and discuss like pros and cons and approaches. So just a format for how to make a decision, a technical decision. That is, as I've said before, is a very good way of dealing with something where you have a large-scale decision that you're going to make, something that has a fairly big impact on maybe more people than yourself. Ideally, something that has more than one team involved. But for something like this, if you, for example, say that your software developer calls you up and says, "Hey, I need to make this, I don't know, I need to make this class instead of that class, or I need to make this button that color instead of that button because of reasons," that's a bit much to create an entire this gigantic document and then weigh pros and cons and go through all of that bureaucracy in order to make such a small decision. So in those situations, the thing that I usually refer to here is just traceability. Create traceability for that's the only thing you want. You don't want to make it a big piece of documentation. It's just a breadcrumb type of thing. You create something that can give you some type of mental hook back to the thing that you talked about, and the big RFCs, ADRs, like these sorts of things, that's more permanent documentation. It's the same thing with product documentation or public, how you do certain processes, or how, like these long living pieces of documentation. But here it's fine to do just a story card comment. So what I usually tell people is this is my style of doing it, at the very least, when I talk about scope creep or decisions made on a story. So make sure that you write a good story specification. That's number one. The reason why that is important is because most people suck at it. Practically everybody does. They don't fill out a good description of like what are we supposed to be doing, and they don't put any acceptance criteria or anything like that. I always do this. So my format is very simple. I write a description saying that we're going to build this thing because we need to achieve this, and here are some examples. If I have screenshots or some more videos or some artboards or something like that, here are a few reference screenshots or references that you can look at to sort of get what we're going to make. The reason why I make that slightly larger investment, so instead of taking 2 seconds to just write "do stuff," I actually take a little bit more time to write it sort of well, not perfectly, that's not the intention, but it has to give me enough of a context so that I can remember what I was doing. It's the same thing with having a to-do list or something like that. If you write a really shitty little one-liner, clean stuff, that's not going to make you remember that, oh yeah, you already cleaned you cleaned your bedroom, but you didn't clean, say, the bathroom or something like that. That's not good enough. As I said, it has to give you enough of a enough of a mental hook back to what you were thinking at that time, or a footnote basically, so that you can get back into that context. That's number one. Number two is, as I said, the acceptance criteria, and specifying that to start off with, because now you know what you're supposed to achieve. And so if your developer now calls up and says that, yeah, you have written that we need to achieve these things, but I have to do something slightly different, then you tell them this one very important thing. Put a comment on, because every story card has some type of comment section. Don't change the original acceptance criteria. Don't change the original description. Add a comment. Just append only, because what now happens is that you can trace what the original specification was and you can see how the scope changed. And a comment is a perfect way of doing that. And then you ask your software developer, if say that you're not at your computer or something like that, cool, do this thing that I just instructed you to do, and then write on the card what we talked about, what we just said. Write that and send me a link when you wrote that thing so that I can check what you wrote. Or maybe you write it. It doesn't really matter who does it. Just make sure that there's a connection that you both see, and then you send the link so that you both see the message that was just written. And now you have a very short, very simple little contract between the two of you, and both of you remember what you talked about, right? The reason why this is important is because now this might never be used again, because you might remember. But if you are in the situation that you are describing, where you have a hard time remembering, then the only thing that you have to remember in order to get back to the same mental context that you had when you were discussing the thing is that you have to remember the story card number. That's it. As soon as you find the story card, you will remember the decision. And then if it turns out that this little tiny decision that you made fits into something bigger, maybe it has to be upgraded to like a long-term guide or new documentation, well, that's easy. You made this tiny little footnote that makes you remember what you decided, and there's a ledger or like an append-only way of looking at the scope change, and now you can upgrade that to some type of permanent documentation or something like that if you actually need to. But if you don't need to, you haven't done more than the bare minimum to just get back to the same mental context you had when you made a decision. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I remember decisions that I make is that I use the story card, basically. It's not that difficult. Make sure that when you write story cards that you sort of separate the two of like long-term permanent documentation like ADRs, RFCs, onboarding guides and tutorials and all this sort of long-term stuff, right, which usually requires a bigger investment, and learn how to create very effective small footnotes or mental hooks or something like that that makes you remember what you were thinking at a given time. It's the same thing at being effective at writing calendar messages for yourself, so you remember you should take out the trash or what you did when you clean and so forth. It's about being organized, basically, because you know that you're going to forget. It's meta thinking. You know that you're going to forget what this was about, so now you need to get enough of a sample size of the thing you were thinking so that you can remember what you were thinking at that time. So don't just do a little one-liner, because it's probably going to end with you realizing that, shit, yeah, I wrote that, but I don't remember what it meant. So make sure that you do it slightly more. It doesn't have to be big, just enough so that you can remember. Write some acceptance criteria for what you're going to achieve, and then when things change, don't change the original specification, just append at each step, because then you can get a history of how this story was delivered and the decisions you made after you realized that the original specification wasn't completely correct. And now all you need is to either forget about that thing, that it ever existed. It just took you maybe a minute or two longer than it would have if you just did nothing, but you have a footnote somewhere where if you need to remember, all you have to do is to do a little search in among the story cards, find that card, and now you can come back to that mental context. Have a great day.